needs to be very aware of what is going on, because what is happening will be China will be paying for the gas probably in rubles, and so consequently what will happen between these two countries is that they will be trading in their own respective currencies. So Russia will hold a lot of Chinese yuan, and China may be holding a lot of Russian rubles. Consequently, they will not be holding US dollars as a result.
It's a point we brought up a few times in the last week when the subject turns to Russia and their latest bloody affair in the Ukraine, but it seems to be wandering around the periphery in many notable minds. Can't do that any longer. While we're all concerned with what is next for the bear, we cannot lose sight of their friendship with China and what that can bring to the table as the world seeks to punish the dictator Vladimir Putin. Let's welcome to MidPoint former Deputy Assistant to Vice President Dick Cheney for National Security Affairs and the CEO of D.C. International Advisory, Stephen Yates, joins us in MidPoint. Stephen, thanks so much for being here today.
Very happy to be with you. Thank you.
Is it fair to say that we are perhaps missing the boat when it comes to China, that in essence what is happening now with Putin, we also need to keep that scant eye at what China thinks about this and how they may use it to their advantage?
In several ways, actually, but we're human, and we put people atop of government. A lot of times they can focus only on really one thing at a time, and sometimes they don't even do a good job at that. There are a lot of parallels between the challenge we've been facing with Russia and Ukraine and things that could happen in East Asia. China has revisionist territorial claims. There are financial dealings between Russia and China that are of great consequence. A lot of times they block and tackle for one another at the UN Security Council, shielding the other party from sanctions or other kinds of pressure internationally. And so it's quite right to look at how we're thinking about and dealing with Russia and be mindful of similar concerns with China.
We've got maybe 20, 25 years of Cold War uneasiness here between these two nations now, these two superpowers here. Why are they starting to drift closer together?
Well, in some ways, they have marriages of convenience when their interests align. They have a common interest in trying to push back the United States and others if we have moralistic claims on human rights. And they have interest from time to time in trying to take the U.S. down a notch in its competitive advantages with them or with other parties around the world. But they're also both dependent on us, China especially so, in having a voracious consumer market in America continue to take in enormous amounts of goods that are made in China, much to China's advantage. So China in some ways is vulnerable to market swings in ways that Russia is less so. So the threat of sanctions would have a greater impact on China than it does, say, in our dealings with Russia in recent months.
When you talk about China, of course, and a lot of the economics that go on here right now, in your opinion, and knowing the two sides here and the relationship as you do, with regard to Vladimir Putin and Putin right now and the way that he is pretty much stonewalling and he is telling the West, we didn't do it, we're here. It's the same old Cold War rhetoric that we have heard for so long. Is there a possibility that the Chinese, because they are drifting closer together, may then go to Putin and tell him either back off, calm down, to use the euphemism, if you will, chill out a little bit and kind of and wait for things to settle down, maybe use a little bit of their power with him?
I would say only if there's real evidence to the Chinese leaders that this is costing them something. At this point, it's mostly public relations. If there is a significant fluctuation in the price of oil, that will be something that gets the Chinese leaders' attention greatly. But it's going to have to be something that's significant and over time. Absent that, they tend not to go to Putin and other strong leaders and tell them how they should be doing things, and they also have some sympathy with what Putin is doing. They have revisionist territorial claims. There are occasionally conflicts where they will deny whether they had anything to do with it, whether their fishing boats were really doing things on behalf of the government. And so they seek solidarity with Putin in his effort to say, wait a minute, you don't have any evidence, you shouldn't be sanctioning us.
When we look at the People's Daily, the Chinese publication here, I want to show everybody here a quick headline and some news from July the 20th that came out. And this is where they are basically showing their support for Putin. Russian President Vladimir Putin has reiterated the importance for all sides not to make hasty conclusions and politicized statements until the investigation of the Malaysian airliner crash is over. No proof has been found so far to clarify the cause or identify the perpetrator. If you put into context what is going on here right now, China says one of their foreign policy bedrocks is always we want to stay out of other nations' internal affairs here right now. So it really is a little bit of a dichotomy here, because certainly Russia is doing absolutely that in Crimea right now. So is it something of a mixed signal, and what might be behind that?
Well, it very much is a mixed signal, but communists tend not to have a problem with contradictions, and I think that's basically one of the bedrock challenges we have here. Non-intervention is supposed to be one of the cardinal rules of their foreign policy. Russia not only intervened in Ukraine, it took territory, and it has these rebels that only basically someone with their head completely in the sand would say aren't actually Russian supported, if not outright Russian military forces and capabilities. China, in this case, is basically using almost the Pravda model in their own publication to try to say what their version of the truth is. It may be the case that we don't have video proof of who did this, and there may be some problems with the crime scene in the Ukraine, but part of that problem is because the rebels don't give people access that standard international procedure would call for in a crash like this, especially an incident involving a takedown by surface-to-air missile. So this is an example of China aligning on propaganda with Russia, trying to tell people to cool down.
When we see, as American consumers, so many products, I know I do it, a number of people do it as well. We pick up the products and we see those three words that we see on, it seems, almost 90% of what we use these days, made in China. So we think of American consumers, I believe, as China of something of a friend. They're there to help us. They're a consumer-friendly nation. All the talk of the debt seems to go away sometimes. We seem to be very satisfied in that. Are we missing the boat in many ways? And again, I'm not trying to throw us back into the Cold War, if you will, between us and China, but are we missing the boat sometimes to think that they're all here just because it's money and debt service? This is still a very potent military sitting there, and it is still something that if we are going to be very judicious in how we look at the rest of the world, we need to keep that eye on China always, just in case.
Oh, I completely agree. I don't think it has to be back into a Cold War mindset, as basically the Chinese news service and others would like to say this kind of thinking describes. I think we just need to be realistic. China has a sizable military. It has advanced greatly in recent decades. They have revisionist sovereignty claims. They do, in material ways, undermine our alliances with key partners in Asia. They have enabled a nuclear North Korea. This is not an everyday challenge or a run-of-the-mill challenge. This is a serious strategic, geostrategic challenge, and we have to take it seriously in all of those forms. We have a deep and complicated economic relationship. The people of China are not necessarily the same as the government of China, but we have to be mindful that the government has power, and they're the ones that we interact with in terms of government-to-government relations. The economic relationship can do some good, but we have to be careful with that too.
Would you agree then with some who say that because of that tight economic relationship we have now with the Chinese, simply because of consumer products and also debt service, that maybe the Chinese are playing us beautifully?
Tell the control room that the IFB just dropped.
Okay, I think he couldn't hear us. You can hear there from Idaho that he cannot hear us right now. We'll go ahead and see if we can reestablish that. Stephen, let's try once again. Can you hear us okay? Okay, the IFB dropped right now. We got a couple of minutes left. Let's see if we can reestablish, because I want to get his answer back on that one question here, because too often it seems that we still look at China as being the friendly neighbor, if you will. They're here. They supply us with a tremendous amount of goods. And yet it would seem that certainly the American consumer, and maybe even the American government in so many ways, still likes to look at China and say, well, wait a minute, everything's okay, they're now our friends, everything is over from the past here right now. When in essence, if you talk to some of the experts who look at what China is doing, and they still have an eye on that Chinese military and the Chinese government, remembering that it is a communist government, they'll still be the ones to tell you that there still is a slight problem here, and we've got to be very, very careful with what we do with the Chinese. Also, it comes down to, once again, to what kind of a respect factor the Chinese have for the American presidency at this point. We have talked many times about how many nations around the country simply do not have the respect for Barack Obama that many other nations had for George Bush, a Bill Clinton, a George H.W. Bush. So that absolutely has to walk its way into the discussion sooner or later. It is also fair to say that when you look at what's happening between Moscow and China, these two neighbors have a real antipathy toward the Western democratic values. They have a mutual interest in natural resources. They are now coming closer together. So if you look at what Vladimir Putin is now doing, when Putin basically tells the Americans, the European Union, and others that this is what we're doing, we're not going to listen to you, we don't need to listen to you, you then have to begin to wonder who he has behind him. And then again, what kind of power he thinks he has. The Chinese are somebody, they are our friends, they are working with us, they hold our debt service, let's not forget. But in the same breath, this is still a nation that at the end of the day, and as you heard him mention here, basically has a lot to do with North Korea, and in the same breath is still a communist nation that still views us as perhaps the dirty capitalist. Okay, maybe not the dirty capitalist because they're willing to take our money, but in the same breath, they still look at us that way, all right? We will have to move on, and we thank Stephen Yates. On deck, what happens when a group of African Americans goes to an NAACP meeting and lets it be known they are Republicans? That's next on MidPoint.